The first time Belle Lockhart saw Joseph Ramsey, he was standing at the edge of the Caldwell mercantile porch with his hat pulled low and his eyes fixed somewhere on the distant Kansas horizon. And she decided immediately that he was the most infuriating man she had ever laid eyes upon, not because he was frightening or cruel, but because he looked right through her as though she were made of window glass. It was the spring of 1873, and the town of Caldwell, Kansas sat just north of the Kishom Trail like a bead strung on a thread of dust and cattle and ambition. The town was alive with the business of cattle drives moving north and the railroad pushing its iron bones through land that had only recently known silence. Belle had arrived in Caldwell 3 weeks prior, having traveled from her family home in Missouri after her father, Thomas Lockhart, had accepted a position as the town's new schoolteacher following the sudden departure of the previous one, a man named Granger who had taken up with a widow woman in Wichita and never come back. Belle was 22 years old, with dark brown hair that she wore pinned up in the practical manner she had been raised to keep, and eyes the color of creek water catching afternoon light, something between green and gray and impossible to name. She was not soft or idle. Her mother had died when Belle was 14, and she had spent the years since managing the household, keeping accounts, and helping her father with lesson preparations. She had read more books than most men in Caldwell had seen in their lifetimes, and she carried that knowledge quietly, like a lantern kept behind glass. She had come to the mercantile that particular morning to purchase fabric for new curtains for the small house she and her father had been given at the edge of town, and she had brought a list written in her careful, even hand. The owner of the mercantile was a round, cheerful man named Hector Finch, who talked without pause from the moment she pushed through the door. He told her about the price of calico, the quality of his newest bolt of blue cotton, the scandalous cost of sugar since the railroad trouble the previous season, and the upcoming arrival of a cattle drive from Texas that would make the whole town busier than a kicked ant hill. It was while Hector was measuring out fabric that Belle glanced through the open doorway and saw the man on the porch. He was tall, built in the lean, capable way of men who spent their lives working land and livestock rather than sitting behind counters. He wore a dark hat, a canvas work shirt, and worn leather gloves tucked into the front of his belt. His jaw carried a few days of dark stubble, and he had the kind of still, composed expression that made it impossible to tell what he was thinking. He wasn't doing anything remarkable. He was simply standing there, looking out at the street, one shoulder propped against the post of the porch overhang. He turned his head slightly, and his gaze crossed the doorway and found Belle for just a moment before it moved on, returning to the middle distance without any particular change in his expression. No nod, no tip of the hat, no acknowledgement whatsoever. Belle turned back to Hector Finch and pretended she had not noticed. "Who is that man on your porch?" she asked, keeping her voice entirely casual. Hector glanced up and smiled broadly. "That's Joseph Ramsey, best hand on the Caldwell Range. Works for Emmett Dole out at the Double Cross Ranch, has for about 4 years now. Good man, quiet though, does not say much." "I noticed," Belle said evenly, and she paid for her fabric and went home. She told herself she forgot about him entirely by the time she reached her front door, and she almost believed it. But Caldwell was not a large town. It had a main street that ran north to south with saloons, a hotel, a bank that had been robbed twice and rebuilt once, a livery, a doctor's office, and Hector Finch's mercantile. There was a church at the north end, a small schoolhouse beside it where her father now taught reading and arithmetic to the children of ranchers and farmers, and a scattering of homes spreading out from the center like ripples in a pond. A person could not remain invisible in Caldwell for long. Belle saw Joseph Ramsey again 2 days later at the post office, where he was collecting a package and speaking to the postmaster, Tom Birch, in a low, brief exchange that ended quickly. He turned and nearly walked into Belle where she stood in the doorway, and for a single startled second their eyes met at very close distance. His were dark brown, nearly black, with a clarity and steadiness to them that made her heart do something embarrassing before she collected herself. "Excuse me, miss," he said, and stepped around her and walked away down the street. That was all. 2 words. Belle collected her father's correspondence and walked home feeling unaccountably irritated. The weeks that followed settled into a rhythm. Her father, Thomas Lockhart, was a gentle, scholarly man of 54 who threw himself into his new role with the enthusiasm of someone who had found his calling late and was grateful for every moment of it. He knew every child's name within a week. He started a lending library in the corner of the schoolroom, bringing out books from the 3 trunks they had hauled from Missouri. He became a fixture at the church socials and the Saturday markets, and he introduced himself to everyone in town with the same warm, open curiosity he brought to everything. Belle managed their home, helped with whatever the schoolroom needed, and gradually began to know the town. She liked Caldwell despite herself. She liked the enormous open sky above it, and the way the wind moved through the long grass on the edges of town, making sounds like the pages of a book turning. She liked the way people here were genuinely occupied with living, without the pretension she had sometimes felt stifled by back in Missouri. And she liked the community that had formed around her father's school, the mothers who brought baked goods to thank him, the ranching families who came in on Saturdays with dust still on their boots. She saw Joseph Ramsey at the Saturday market. She saw him at church, sitting in the back row on the far right, alone, with his hat in his hands and his eyes forward during the whole of Reverend Cole's sermon. She saw him watering his horse at the trough on Main Street on 3 separate occasions, and every single time he saw her see him, and he gave her nothing, not a smile, not a word, not the simple social grace of a nod that every other person in Caldwell had learned to offer one another as a matter of basic courtesy. By June, Belle was not simply irritated. She was convinced. Joseph Ramsey did not like her. She could think of no other explanation. She was a reasonable, sociable person. She had friends. Her father was well regarded. She had not done anything to offend the man, and yet he treated her as though she were a fixture of the landscape rather than a human being. She discussed it exactly once with her father, who laughed gently and told her that some men were simply shy and that she ought not to read too much into silence. "Shy," Belle repeated flatly. "Some men find words difficult, Belle. That does not mean they are unfriendly." "It means they are unfriendly to me specifically," she said. "Every other woman in this town he manages at least a good morning. I have counted." Her father looked at her over his spectacles with the mild, knowing expression that had been driving her mildly insane since she was 6 years old. "Have you really?" he said. Belle did not answer that because the answer was yes, and she knew exactly what it implied about where her attention had been going, and she refused to think about that. She threw herself into the summer with purpose. She organized a lending system for her father's books among the older children. She helped Reverend Cole's wife, Martha, with the preparation of a church social that brought nearly the whole town together on a Friday evening in late June. She made friends with Clara Finch, Hector's daughter, who was 19 and possessed of a warm, chattering energy that Belle found genuinely refreshing. And she tried, consciously and deliberately, to stop noticing Joseph Ramsey. She was largely unsuccessful. At the church social, she saw him arrive with 2 other ranch hands from the Double Cross, a cheerful young man named Pete Stallo who danced with every woman who would have him, and an older, weathered hand named Clyde Dubois who had a white mustache and a dry sense of humor that made the whole room laugh. Joseph sat at the edge of the gathering with a cup of coffee, watching the dancing with that same composed, unreadable expression. Clara Finch appeared at Belle's elbow. "He is not unfriendly, you know," she said, as though she had been reading Belle's thoughts, which was a talent Clara seemed to have developed specifically for the purpose of being both helpful and mortifying. "I did not say he was," Belle said. "You were thinking it. You get a very particular look when you are thinking it." Clara popped a piece of cornbread into her mouth cheerfully. "My father says Joseph Ramsey is the most decent man on the Caldwell range." He helped Hank Mercer rebuild his barn last winter after it burned, and he did not take a cent for it. He just showed up with lumber." Belle said nothing. "He is just quiet," Clara went on. "He has always been quiet. He was quiet when he first came to Caldwell 4 years ago, and he has been quiet every year since. It is just who he is." Belle glanced across the room to where Joseph sat with his coffee, and at that precise moment he looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but directly at her, with the full weight of his gaze, and this time he did not look away immediately. He held it for 3 full seconds before he turned back to his coffee. Belle felt the heat rise in her neck before she could stop it, and she turned back to Clara with great dignity. "I am going to get some lemonade," she said. Clara smiled into her cornbread and said nothing. The summer deepened and the cattle drives moved through Caldwell, bringing with them the noise and commerce and occasional lawlessness that defined the town's character. Caldwell had its share of trouble. The town marshal, a capable man named Frank Haley, kept the worst of it managed, but there were rough nights in the saloons and occasional disputes over cattle that required firm handling. Belle's father warned her to stay in at night when the drives came through, and she did mostly, though she sat on the porch in the warm evenings and listened to the town's noises with great interest. One evening in late July, she was returning from visiting Clara Finch just as the last of the evening light was fading from the sky, and she turned the corner at the edge of the mercantile block to find 3 men she did not recognize blocking the narrow path between the buildings. They were trail hands, by the look of them, dusty and loud with the particular looseness that came from a full evening at the saloon. They were not violent, not exactly, but they were in the way, and they were looking at her with an interest that made the back of her neck prickle. "Well now," said the tallest one, swaying slightly, "where are you going so fast?" Belle squared her shoulders and kept her voice level. "Home," she said, and moved to step around them. The man shifted to block her, still with that grin, and his 2 companions laughed. It was the kind of laughter that was not aimed at anything funny, and Belle felt a cold clarity drop through her, the kind her mother had told her about, the kind that meant you stayed very still and very calm and looked for the way out. She heard boots on the boardwalk behind her, and one of the men glanced up, and whatever he saw in the approaching figure made his grin fade by several degrees. "Move along," said a voice, quiet and direct. Belle turned her head. Joseph Ramsey stood a few feet back, not running, not dramatic, just standing in the street with the ease of someone who was entirely at home in his own body and entirely unafraid of whatever the evening might bring. The 3 men looked at him. He looked back. "Private conversation," said the tall one, but his voice had lost a good deal of its confidence. "Not any more," Joseph said. There was a pause that stretched like the moment before a wagon wheel decides whether to hold or brake, and then the tall man shrugged and stepped aside, and the 3 of them moved off down the street without another word. Joseph watched them go until they had turned the corner, and then he turned to Belle. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Thank you." He nodded once, the same way he had always done with her, that brief, contained acknowledgement that gave away nothing. He turned to go. "Wait," she said before she could think better of it. He stopped. Belle Lockhart was not accustomed to not knowing what to say next, but she stood there for a moment in the fading evening light with the words tangled up somewhere between her heart and her mouth, and what came out was not gracious or clever. "Why do you not like me?" she said. The silence that followed was unlike any silence she had experienced before. It was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had a weight to it, a texture. Joseph Ramsey stood very still with his back half turned to her, and then he turned the rest of the way around, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen there before. It was not blankness. It was the opposite of blankness. It was the face of a man holding something very carefully, the way you hold something fragile in rough hands, with tremendous, quiet concentration. "What?" he said. "You have never spoken to me beyond the bare minimum of politeness," Belle said, keeping her voice steady with effort. "Every person in this town, you at least manage a good morning. You ask after their families. You tipped your hat to Mrs. Cole when her husband's sermons put half the congregation to sleep, and she noticed, and she was grateful. But to me you say nothing. And I have been trying to understand it for 2 months, and I cannot, so I am asking you directly. Joseph was quiet for a moment that felt like a very long time. The street was empty now. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted from one of the saloons, a fiddle playing something bright and sweet that seemed entirely at odds with the seriousness of the moment. "I'm not quiet because I do not like you," he said finally. "Then why?" He looked at her directly, with those clear, dark eyes, and something shifted in his expression, something resolving, like a long-held question finding its answer. "I was quiet," he said, "because I liked you too much." Belle stared at him. "Because I liked you too much to trust myself to say something worth hearing," he went on, each word deliberate and honest in the way of a man who does not speak often and means every word he does. "The first time I saw you walk into Hector's store, I could not think of a single thing that would not sound like a fool saying it. So I said nothing. And then more time passed, and the nothing I had said began to feel too large to step over, and I did not know how to start. That is all. That is the whole of it." Belle stood in the blue evening and felt something shift inside her chest, not the heat of irritation which she was very familiar with, something else, something quieter and deeper and more serious. "That," she said after a moment, "is the most backward and also the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me." His mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, not yet, but it was something in that direction, something that changed his face entirely and made him look younger and less composed and entirely more human. "I expect it is," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Joseph Ramsey," she said. "I am Belle Lockhart." "I know," he said. "And now you are going to start talking to me," she told him. It was not entirely a question. "If you will let me," he said. "I intend to insist on it," she said. And that was how it began. The summer that followed was one of the finest of Belle Lockhart's life, though she did not fully understand that yet as it was happening. It crept up on her the way good things sometimes do, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of small, ordinary ones that only reveal their true weight when you look back at them. Joseph came by the schoolhouse the following Saturday morning on the pretense of speaking to her father about a library book Thomas had offered to lend him, and he stayed for 2 hours on the porch, talking to Belle about the Kishom Trail, the cattle business, the nature of the Kansas sky in different seasons, and the question of whether the coming railroad expansion would change the character of the town permanently or simply temporarily. He had opinions, quietly held but not at all vague or uncertain. He thought the railroad would bring more people and more money, and that both of these things were neutral forces that became good or bad depending on what people chose to do with them. He thought the land was worth protecting in a way that most cattle men had not yet learned to think about. He had read 4 books from Thomas's lending shelf in the past year, borrowing them from Hector Finch, who had been intermediating without anyone asking him to. Belle listened and asked questions and listened again, and she felt the strange, particular pleasure of talking to someone who took ideas seriously, who answered carefully, who did not fill space with words just because silence made them nervous. She walked with him to the edge of the schoolhouse property when he left, and he said goodbye and thanked her, and she watched him ride away on a dark roan horse and thought that she had entirely misjudged the nature of the problem. She had thought his silence was a verdict. It had been a confession. Through August, they fell into the habit of company that neither of them announced or formalized, but which grew with the natural ease of something that had been wanting to exist for some time. He appeared on Sunday evenings when the ranch work was lighter and sat with her and her father on the porch. He walked with her to the Saturday market. He helped her father repair the fence around the schoolyard when one section collapsed in a summer storm, working alongside Thomas with the matter-of-fact competence of a man for whom physical work was simply a natural part of being alive. Belle learned him the way you learn a landscape, not all at once but gradually, piece by piece, until what had seemed uniform and unreadable became detailed and rich. She learned that he had come to Caldwell from a small town in Texas, that his parents were both gone, his mother when he was 12 and his father 3 years later, and that he had made his own way from the age of 15 with a stubbornness he did not name as stubbornness, but which was plainly visible to anyone paying attention. She learned that he was 30 years old to her 22, that he read whenever he could get his hands on something worth reading, that he had a dry, quiet humor that came out in small, unexpected moments, and was made funnier by the fact that his expression never changed when he was being funny. She learned that he was deeply decent in a way that was not performed or calculated. He was decent to the Mexican cattle workers who passed through on the drives and were often treated with little regard by the town. He was decent to Hector's daughter Clara, whom he had always treated with the matter-of-fact respect of someone who found condescension exhausting. He had, without anyone asking him to, become something of a quiet guardian of the neighborhood around the schoolhouse, which was on the edge of town and sometimes troubled by the noise of the drives. People knew he was there, and it was enough. Belle told her father one evening after Joseph had ridden away from one of their Sunday visits that she thought she was beginning to understand him. Thomas Lockhart set down his book and looked at his daughter over his spectacles with that same mild, knowing expression. "Are you?" he said. "He is not a difficult person," Belle said. "He is just very particular about what he says out loud. And you appreciate that." "I do, very much." She paused. "I appreciate a great deal about him." "I gathered that," Thomas said, and went back to his book, and Belle went to bed with the pleasant, weightless feeling of something beginning that she had not known she had been waiting for. In the first week of September, the Double Cross Ranch had its annual end-of-summer muster, and Emmett Dole, the owner, threw a barbecue at the ranch for the hands and their families and half the town, as was his custom. Emmett was a big, gregarious man in his 50s who had built the Double Cross from raw land over 20 years, and who was proud of it in the uncomplicated way of someone who had earned the right to be. He was fond of Joseph in the slightly formal way of a man who valued excellence and did not quite know how to express it, and he had said to half a dozen people in the past 4 years that Joseph Ramsey was the most reliable man he had ever hired. Belle went to the barbecue with her father and Clara Finch, who had dressed with the particular care of someone hoping to be noticed by Pete Stallo, which was visible to everyone present. The ranch was 2 miles out of town, a proper spread with a large house and a series of well-kept outbuildings, and a creek that ran along the south edge of the property. The afternoon was gold and enormous, the Kansas sky doing its best work with clouds the size of mountain ranges moving slowly overhead. Joseph found her almost as soon as she arrived, which was not accidental, and she knew it was not accidental, and the knowledge of that sent a small bright warmth through her. He brought her a plate of food before she had quite gotten oriented, and she thanked him and looked up at him and thought that, in the full daylight, with his hat pushed back a little, and the stiffness he carried in public slightly eased, he was more than attractive. He was the kind of handsome that took you a moment to recognize, because it was bound up so thoroughly with character that you could not separate the two. They walked along the creek while her father talked cattle with Emmett, and Clara executed her campaign regarding Pete Stallo with great determination. The creek was low and bright in the late summer, running over flat stones, and the cottonwoods along its bank had begun their slow turn toward yellow. They talked about the fall, about the cattle drive that would be the last of the season, about the books they had both been reading. And then Joseph stopped walking and turned to her, and the directness of his gaze was something she had grown accustomed to but which still managed, somehow, to make the rest of the world go slightly quiet. "Belle," he said. "Yes," she said. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If you are willing, if your father is willing, I would like to do this the right way." Belle looked at him for a moment. "Have you already spoken to my father?" The smallest pause. "He said it was your decision." "It is absolutely my decision," she agreed. "What did you say to him?" I said I intended to ask you if I could court you, and that I wanted to do it honestly, and that my intentions were entirely serious." Belle felt something warm and certain settle in her chest. "And what did he say?" "He said that you were the most sensible and particular person he had ever met, and that if you said yes, it was because you meant it and that he trusted you completely." A beat. And then he went back to talking about cattle. Belle laughed. It surprised both of them, the fullness of it, the genuine delight. Joseph looked at her the way she imagined people looked at unexpected sunlight, slightly unprepared but grateful. "Yes," she said, "I am willing." He nodded slowly, and the smile that had been something almost there all these months came the rest of the way, and it changed his entire face, and Belle thought with perfect clarity that she had been entirely correct 2 months ago in the mercantile doorway, before she had even understood the situation. She had known there was something remarkable in that still, composed face. She had just been too irritated to name it correctly. The courtship of Belle Lockhart and Joseph Ramsey was conducted with the seriousness they both brought to things they cared about, and also with a great deal of warmth that surprised both of them in its ease. He came to dinner on Thursday evenings, which Thomas had offered as the formal occasion, and he came on Sunday afternoons for the porch visits that had been happening since August anyway. And in between there were incidental meetings at the mercantile and the post office and the Saturday market that were neither formal nor planned, but which both of them arranged with perfectly transparent casualness. Clara Finch, whose campaign regarding Pete Stallo had been entirely successful, was delighted and said so at great length. Hector Finch said he had been wondering when those two would sort themselves out. Pete Stallo congratulated Joseph at the ranch with a great deal of enthusiasm and clapping him on the shoulder until Joseph told him that was enough. Clyde Dubois said nothing, but he stopped calling Joseph the monk when referring to him at the bunkhouse, which was, in its way, the most significant acknowledgment of all. On a Thursday evening in late September, after dinner, when Thomas Lockhart had taken himself off to his study with the transparency of a man ensuring his daughter had some privacy, Joseph and Belle sat on the porch in the cooling evening and talked about the future in the way that people do when they have begun to think of their futures as connected. He told her about the land he had been putting money aside for, a parcel of property 12 miles south of Caldwell that had good water and good grass, and that Emmett Dole had offered to help him acquire at a reasonable price. He told her about what he wanted to build there, a proper house, not grand but well made, with a garden and room enough for a family. Belle listened to him talk about this land and felt something that was not quite longing and not quite recognition, but somewhere between the two. She had grown up in Missouri knowing the life she was expected to live, a life determined largely by what was available to her, and she had made her peace with it in the way that practical people make their peace with things. But sitting here in the Kansas evening with Joseph Ramsey talking about a future that had space in it for something of her own, something she might help build, she felt the edge of something larger than she had let herself imagine. "What would you do," she said, "if you had children?" He looked at her with the careful attention he gave everything she said. "I would try to raise them honestly," he said, "to know how to work, to be decent, to read." He paused. "To know they were wanted." That last thing landed gently, but it landed fully, and Belle understood the shape of it, the weight of his own childhood beneath it, the particular ambition of someone who had not had that knowledge themselves and had decided that the children they might have would know it without question. "I think you will be very good at it," she said quietly. "I hope so," he said. She looked out at the dark street, the distant lights of the main block, the enormous sky above the town showing its first stars. "I would want to keep teaching," she said. "Not in the school necessarily, but I would want to be useful with what I know." "There is no reason you should not be," he said simply, as though this were obvious, because to him it was. October brought a sharpness to the Kansas air, and a gold light that made the whole prairie seem to glow from within. The last cattle drives of the season came through Caldwell, and the town had its last surge of noise and commerce before the quieter winter settled in. Belle spent her mornings helping her father with the school and her afternoons on various projects of her own, and she was happy in the solid, unglamorous, deeply real way that she had come to value more than any other kind. On the first Saturday in October, Joseph came to the mercantile while she was there, and Hector Finch busied himself at the far end of the shop with the transparency of a man who had been asked to do so. Joseph stood across the counter from Belle and reached into his vest pocket and set down on the counter a ring, plain gold with a small setting of garnets, dark red as autumn leaves. "I made inquiries at the jeweler in Wichita last month," he said, "about what you might prefer. I asked Clara Finch." Belle looked at the ring and then at him. "You planned this." "I thought about it for some time, yes." "What did Clara say?" "She said you would say yes if I asked you straight and did not make a performance of it." He met her eyes. "So I am asking you straight. Will you marry me, Belle?" Belle picked up the ring and looked at it in the morning light coming through the window at the deep red of the garnets, and then she set it back down and reached across the counter and took his hand, which was large and warm and entirely steady, and she said, "Yes, Joseph, I will." He closed his hand around hers and held it for a moment, and the quiet between them was full of everything they both understood. Hector Finch from the far end of the shop said, "I'll be putting out word then," and Joseph said, without turning around, "Hector," in a tone that was warning and resigned and faintly amused all at once, and Belle laughed again with that same full, genuine laugh that still, every time, made Joseph look at her as though sunlight had arrived without warning. They were married in the Caldwell church on the last Saturday in November, 1873, when the Kansas sky was the color of pewter and the wind from the north carried the first breath of a winter that would be long and cold and beautiful. Reverend Cole performed the ceremony. Thomas Lockhart walked his daughter down the aisle and shook Joseph's hand afterward with both hands, which was the most emotional expression Thomas was capable of, and it was understood by everyone present to be profound. Clara Finch was Belle's attendant. Pete Stallo was Joseph's. Clyde Dubois sat in the second row and straightened his white mustache throughout the whole ceremony with the careful dignity of a man attending a state occasion. Emmett Dole was there with his wife, Margaret, a quiet and practical woman who shook Belle's hand after the ceremony and said, "I am glad he found someone," with the direct simplicity of someone who meant it entirely. Belle wore a dress of deep blue wool that she and Clara had made over 3 evenings, and she carried autumn berries that Clara had gathered and arranged in a way that was both simple and more beautiful than anything elaborate. Joseph wore a dark coat that he had bought in Wichita, and he looked at Belle when she walked down the aisle with the same expression she had seen that evening on the porch when she had laughed, that particular quality of someone receiving something they had not let themselves quite believe in. The ceremony itself was brief and real, as befitted both of them, and the words they said to each other in front of Reverend Cole and the assembled witnesses of Caldwell, Kansas, were simple and entirely meant. Joseph's voice was low and steady when he made his promises, and Belle's was clear and certain when she made hers, and there was not a person in the church who doubted the sincerity of either. The reception was held at the church hall, with food contributed by what seemed like the entire town, and a fiddle player named Amos who had been coaxed out of semi-retirement for the occasion. People danced and ate and talked, and Pete Stallo danced with Clara Finch 4 times, and Clyde Dubois told the same story about cattle he had told every gathering for 3 years, and everyone laughed at it anyway. Thomas Lockhart sat in the corner talking to Emmett Dole and looked, for the whole of the evening, like a man entirely at peace with the world. Belle danced with Joseph twice, which was 2 more times than he had danced in the previous 4 years combined, and he was better at it than she expected, and she told him so, and he said that he had practiced, and the idea of Joseph Ramsey practicing dancing in the barn to prepare for his own wedding was one of the most charming things she had ever been told, and she thought about it for years afterward. The winter they spent in town in the house beside the school, since Joseph's land purchase was still in process, and the farmhouse he planned to build could not be started until spring. They were close neighbors to Thomas, which suited all three of them. Belle learned the rhythms of winter in Kansas, which were different from Missouri, harder and more absolute, with storms that came off the plains with startling force and cold that reached into everything. She and Joseph spent the long evenings by the fire, reading and talking, and she discovered that sharing a house with someone you loved was not the quiet, ordinary thing she had expected, but something richer and stranger, full of small daily revelations that accumulated like interest on a debt. She learned that he rose before the sun without fail, that he was methodical in everything he did, that he kept his word on small things as reliably as large ones. She learned that he had a particular fondness for coffee that was not acceptable by most standards, very black and very strong, and that he made it every morning with great care. She learned that he read slowly and thoroughly, not moving on from a page until he had understood it completely, and that when something struck him as important he read it again. She learned that when he was tired he said even less than usual, not in a shutting-out way, but in the way of someone who understood that his resources were limited and protected them honestly. She told him things in return, in the way she had not expected to tell anyone, not because she was secretive, but because she had not had anyone to tell before. She told him about her mother, about what it had been like to lose her, and to become the person who held things together afterward. She told him about the ambition she had carried quietly for years, the books she had read that made her feel the size of the world and the desire to be more than a small part of it. She told him that she was sometimes impatient and sometimes proud and sometimes wrong, and that she preferred to know these things about herself rather than pretend otherwise. He listened to all of it with the full, serious attention he gave to things that mattered, and he never minimized what she said or offered the kind of reassurance that was really a request to stop bringing up difficult things. He said what he thought, honestly and quietly, and he was sometimes exactly right and sometimes wrong himself, and they argued about things occasionally with the clear, fair way of two people who respected each other too much to fight dirty. February brought a blizzard that shut Caldwell down for 3 days, and they were snowed in together with Thomas, who had come for dinner the evening before the storm hit and could not go home. They played cards by the fire, the three of them, and Thomas told stories about Missouri that Joseph had not heard before, and Belle listened to her father with the warm, bittersweet feeling of someone storing up memories, because Thomas's health, which had been generally good, had shown a few worrying signs in the autumn that she held quietly in the back of her mind. On the second day of the storm, with the wind building walls of white outside the windows and the world reduced to firelight, and the smell of coffee and wood smoke, Joseph sat beside Belle on the small settee and read to her from a volume of natural history that Thomas had lent them. He read well in a low, even voice, and the sound of it combined with the warmth and the storm outside made something in Belle go entirely still and entirely content in a way she had not known she was capable of. She looked at his profile while he read, the line of his jaw and the dark lashes and the particular quality of concentration in his face, and she thought, I spent 2 months thinking this man did not like me. The thought struck her as simultaneously absurd and very dear. What? He said without looking up from the book. Nothing, she said. Keep reading. He did. Spring came to the Kansas plains the way it always did, in a great, eager rush after the long winter, the grass coming up green and vivid across the rolling land, the sky going from pewter to the enormous, dazzling blue that seemed to belong specifically to this part of the world. Belle felt the spring that year with a particular physical pleasure, as though after the long cold the warmth was something to be noticed and savored rather than taken for granted. The land purchase was finalized in March, and Joseph began planning the farmhouse with the same methodical seriousness he brought to everything important. He had saved carefully for years, and he had Emmett Dole's backing for the startup cattle he needed, and he had a clear vision of what he wanted to build. He spent 2 evenings in March drawing plans on paper at the kitchen table, and Belle sat across from him with her own work and offered opinions when asked and occasionally when not asked, which he received without annoyance. The land was 12 miles south of Caldwell, and it was beautiful in the particular way of the Kansas plains, which required a certain willingness to look for beauty that was not vertical or dramatic but horizontal and vast and deeply compelling once you learned to see it. There was a creek, narrow and reliable, lined with cottonwoods. There was a low swell of hill to the east that broke the worst of the north wind. There was grass, long and good, waving in the spring breeze in the way that Belle had always found hypnotic since she arrived in Kansas. They rode out there together on a Sunday in April, leaving her father comfortably settled with a good book and the pretense that he did not know exactly what they were going to do. And she stood beside Joseph on the land and looked at the horizon and felt the future in it like a physical thing. "There," he said, pointing to a spot just south of the cottonwoods, slightly raised with good sightlines in every direction. "That is where the house goes." "With a porch," she said. "South-facing," he agreed. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the land with an expression she recognized now, the expression of someone who was allowing himself to want something fully, without reservation, which for Joseph Ramsey was not an ordinary or easy thing. "We are going to be very happy here," she said. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we are." He said it the way he said things he knew to be true, quietly and without performance, and it was worth more to Belle than any amount of elaborate declaration. Building the farmhouse was a community effort, as things often were on the Kansas plains, where people understood that the land was too big and the winters too hard to manage in isolation. Joseph organized it the way he organized everything, carefully and without drama. Men from the Double Cross came out on 3 consecutive Saturdays in May. Hector Finch donated lumber he claimed he had surplus to his needs. Emmett Dole brought a team and his expertise with framing. Even Clyde Dubois, who claimed his back had been bad since 1869, showed up on the second Saturday and proved remarkably able when he thought no one was looking. Belle organized the feeding of the work crew, which was a significant undertaking, with help from Clara Finch and Margaret Dole. They set up trestle tables in the shade of the cottonwoods and laid out enough food for twice the number of men working, which was the Kansas way. She watched the house take shape over those Saturdays with a feeling she could not quite name, something that combined pride and gratitude, and a kind of wonder at what people could make when they worked together. The house was finished by early June, modest but well built, 2 rooms downstairs and 2 above, with a south-facing porch exactly as planned, and a kitchen that Belle had opinions about and which had been built to those opinions without argument. It was not large, but it was solid and true, and it smelled of fresh-cut wood and the Kansas air, and it was entirely and specifically theirs. They moved into it on a Saturday, with Thomas Lockhart helping carry books and Clara Finch carrying curtains that she and Belle had made over 3 evenings, and Pete Stallo carrying everything else with enormous cheerfulness, while Joseph directed the placement of furniture with the focused efficiency of a general managing a campaign. By evening, the lamps were lit and the curtains were hung and the books were on their shelves, and the kitchen had been used for the first time. And Belle stood on the south-facing porch in the last of the June light and looked out at the land and the enormous sky and felt something complete. Joseph came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "This is ours," she said. "This is ours," he confirmed. She leaned against him and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that for a long time in the evening while the cottonwoods made their soft, rustling sound and the first stars appeared over the Kansas plain. Summer on the homestead was hard work and immensely satisfying. Joseph managed the cattle with the 2 ranch hands he had hired, a young man named Hector Vasquez who had come north from Texas on the last drive and was looking for steady work, and an older man named Sam Whitfield who had been on the plains for 20 years and knew every season of the Kansas land by heart. Belle kept the house, managed the kitchen garden she had planted behind the house, and continued helping her father with the school on the days when she rode into Caldwell, which was twice a week. She had been right about wanting to stay useful with what she knew. Her father was increasingly letting her run more of the older students' lessons, particularly the reading and arithmetic, and she found in teaching the same pleasure she found in everything that required genuine engagement, the pleasure of seeing understanding arrive in someone's face, of finding the right words for a difficult idea, of learning herself in the process of explaining things to others. By July, she knew she was expecting a child, and she told Joseph on a Sunday morning when they were both still at breakfast, quietly and directly as she did everything. He went still for a moment, the way he did when something affected him deeply, and then he looked at her with an expression that was unguarded in the way of someone who has received something they had allowed themselves to want but not to count on. "Are you certain?" he said. "Quite certain." He reached across the table and took her hand and held it in both of his, and he said nothing for a moment, and she let the silence be what it was, which was complete. "How do you feel?" he said. "Perfectly well," she said. "A little tired in the mornings, but otherwise entirely well." He nodded. He was still holding her hand. "Good," he said. "That is good." He was, from that day forward, attentive in a way that was both practically useful and slightly amusing in its thoroughness. He did not fuss or panic. He simply arranged things so that the heaviest work around the property was managed by him or by Sam or Hector Vasquez, and he made sure the kitchen was stocked and the house was warm and that Belle had whatever she indicated she needed before she had to ask more than once. He took her into Caldwell to see Dr. Wendell, the town's physician, a thorough and sensible man who confirmed everything and gave his approval for the general plan of things. Thomas Lockhart received the news with such undisguised joy that he had to take his spectacles off and clean them for a full minute before he could speak properly. Clara Finch declared that she had known it would happen and began immediately knitting something with tremendous speed and enthusiasm. The autumn was the richest Belle had ever known. The crops were good, the cattle were healthy, the prairie turned its deep gold and brown, and the Kansas sky did the remarkable thing it did in autumn of becoming even more vast and various than its summer self, full of enormous weather that passed through like theater. She and Joseph spent their evenings on the porch even as the nights grew cooler, wrapped in quilts, watching the stars. He read to her often, having taken up the habit that had started during the blizzard and found it suited him. He read from Thomas's books, from a newspaper he subscribed to from the Wichita printing, and occasionally from the dime novels that Clara kept providing despite the fact that Joseph's expression when presented with them was one of polite suffering. Belle found this contrast entirely endearing. He talked more. She had noticed it gradually over the course of the year, the way his silence had become less a wall and more a habit he was learning to spend differently around her. Not that he had become a different person. He was still quiet by nature, still economical with words in the way of someone who had learned their value early and did not waste them. But with Belle in their house, in the evenings, he talked in a way that she understood was reserved entirely for her, and which she treated as the gift it was. He told her about Texas, about the years he had spent making his way north and working different ranches and learning the trade. He told her about a man named Abel Cross, who had given him his first real chance at real work when he was 17, and who had treated him with a fairness and respect that Joseph had clearly stored in his memory as a model. He told her about his first winter in Kansas, which had nearly undone him in its severity, and how he had decided in the middle of it that he would stay precisely because of its difficulty, because he did not like the idea of being driven away from something good by something hard. She understood that story. She recognized herself in it. In the first week of April, 1875, their son was born on a Tuesday afternoon with the spring rain coming soft against the windows and Dr. Wendell in attendance, and Thomas Lockhart pacing the length of the front porch until the sound of a baby's voice made him stop in the middle of a step. They named him Thomas James Ramsey. Thomas for Belle's father, James for Joseph's father, gone these 17 years. He was a large, healthy baby with a considerable opinion about the world that he expressed immediately and at volume, and he had Joseph's dark eyes and Belle's coloring, and he was, from the first moment, entirely himself. Joseph held his son for the first time with the same careful, full attention he gave everything that mattered, and he was quieter than Belle had ever seen him, which was saying something, but the quality of his quiet was different. It was the quiet of someone who has arrived somewhere they have been working toward for a long time without quite knowing it, and who is taking a moment to register the fact of their arrival. He looked at Belle. "Thank you," he said. "Joseph," she said, "he is yours too." "I know," he said. "That is what I am thanking you for." Thomas Lockhart met his grandson on the porch, and the expression on his face was one Belle kept with her for the rest of her life, the pure, unguarded joy of it. He held the baby with the practiced ease of a former father and said, "Hello, Thomas," and the baby, as if recognizing the name, ceased his noise for a moment and looked up at the old man with the ancient, unfocused gravity of the very new. Thomas Ramsey, called Tom almost from the beginning, was a vigorous and curious child who began walking early and talking early, and who had his father's quality of concentration without his quietness. He talked constantly, about everything he saw and thought and wondered about, and he followed Joseph around the homestead from the time he could walk steadily, with the absolute determination of a person for whom this particular man was the center of gravity. Joseph bore this with perfect patience and apparent pleasure, answering Tom's unending questions about cattle and grass and weather and horses, and the names of stars with the same seriousness he brought to everything. Belle watched them together and felt a fullness in her chest that was beyond naming. The homestead prospered. By 1876, Joseph had a good-sized cattle operation, modest but solid, and the land had proven itself in the way that good land does, generously and reliably. He had added to the house, a proper study where Belle kept her books and conducted the correspondence she had taken up with a school board in Wichita about methods of teaching reading, and a larger room upstairs that would be needed before long because Belle was expecting again, and this time the feeling was familiar and welcome rather than startling, like returning to a country you have been to before and love. Thomas Lockhart's health, which Belle had watched with quiet worry through the previous 2 years, declined in the winter of 1876 in a way that was not dramatic but was definite, a weakening of his heart that Dr. Wendell described honestly and without false reassurance. He moved to the homestead in February, into the spare room, which was warm and faced east for the morning light he liked. He was not so unwell that he could not sit at the table and eat with them and play with Tom, but he was tired in a way that he had not been before, and Belle recognized it as the beginning of an ending that was natural and coming toward them at its own measured pace. Told her, one afternoon in March when Joseph was out at the cattle and Tom was napping and the two of them were alone in the study, that he was not afraid. He said it the way he said things he had thought about thoroughly, with the clarity of a teacher who has found the right words. "I did not expect to end up in Kansas," he said with the small smile she loved, "but it has been a very fine thing. And you are well, Belle. You are very, very well. Because of you," she said. "Because of everything you taught me." "Because of yourself," he said gently. "I only provided the books." He died in April, 2 weeks after the birth of Belle and Joseph's second child, a daughter this time, small and dark-haired and peaceful, whom they named Sarah Ann, for no one in particular except that the name suited her. Thomas Lockhart held his granddaughter once, briefly, with great gentleness, and he told Belle she was beautiful, and he meant the granddaughter and also Belle, and Belle knew both. The grief of losing her father was real and substantial, and Belle did not attempt to reduce it or move through it faster than it naturally moved. She had learned, losing her mother, that grief was not something to be managed but something to be carried, and that it changed shape over time rather than disappearing, becoming less an open wound and more a permanent part of the landscape, present and accepted. Joseph was with her in it the way he was with her in everything, fully and without performance. He did not tell her it was all right. He did not minimize or deflect. He sat with her in her grief the way he had sat with her through everything, present and steady, and when she cried he held her, and when she needed to talk about her father he listened, and when she needed silence he provided that too. He was good at presence. It was the first thing she had misjudged about him, and it was the thing she had come to understand as his greatest quality. They buried Thomas Lockhart in the Caldwell churchyard, and Reverend Cole gave a service that was warm and specific and true to who Thomas had been, full of the particular kind of humor and learning that Thomas himself had brought to everything. Half the town came, because Thomas Lockhart had made himself part of Caldwell in the way that some people do, by being genuinely useful and genuinely kind, and the town knew what it had lost. The summer of 1876 was long and golden, and the homestead was busy and alive. Tom, who was just past a year, had discovered that running was possible, and was pursuing this discovery with enormous enthusiasm. Sarah Ann was an easy baby, quiet and watchful, with a tendency to observe the world very seriously before committing to an opinion of it that reminded Belle, powerfully and tenderly, of someone. Joseph noticed it too, on an evening in July when Sarah Ann was propped against the cushions of the settee watching the room with her grave, considering gaze. "She looks like she is deciding something," he said. "She always looks like she is deciding something," Belle agreed. He looked at his daughter for a moment with that quality of quiet pleasure that was one of the things Belle loved best in him, that capacity to be entirely present in a moment without requiring the moment to be more than it was. "She reminds me of you," he said. Belle looked at him. "She reminds me of you." They looked at each other and then at the baby, who had reached a decision about something and was making her opinion known in the peaceful, confident way of someone who expects to be heard. The autumn of 1877 brought a good harvest and a new challenge, in the form of a dispute with a neighboring landowner named Charles Aldridge, a man who had come into the area the previous spring with money and a certain attitude toward property lines that was expansive in ways that did not respect what was already established. He claimed that a portion of the creekside land that was clearly part of Joseph's established property was in fact on his side of a boundary that he had decided to reinterpret. Joseph handled this the way he handled trouble generally, with measured patience that had a clear bottom. He spoke to Aldridge directly first, setting out what the existing surveys showed. Aldridge was dismissive in the way of someone who was accustomed to being able to force an outcome, and was not used to being met by a man who was neither impressed nor intimidated. He said the surveys were old, and the county needed new ones, and he said it with the tone of someone who expected this to be the end of the conversation. It was not the end of the conversation. Joseph engaged a land attorney from Wichita, a sharp and methodical man named Augustus Webb, and he gathered every document relating to his property purchase with the same thoroughness he brought to everything, and he pursued the matter through the county land office with a patience that was, in its quiet way, entirely formidable. It took 3 months, but it was resolved entirely in Joseph's favor, because the documents and surveys were unambiguous, and because Augustus Webb was very good at his job, and because Joseph Ramsey was not the kind of man who could be waited out or discouraged. Charles Aldridge left the area the following spring, which was not something Joseph had sought but which was not, either, something he mourned. Belle had helped with the documents and the correspondence throughout the dispute, and when it was resolved she sat across from Joseph at the kitchen table and looked at him with something that was part pride and part amusement. "You were magnificent," she said. He looked slightly surprised by this. "I was correct," he said, "which is not the same thing." "It is," she said, "when you hold your ground the way you did." He considered this. Aldridge expected me to back down, he said. Most people would have, she said. Most people should not, he said simply. And that was all he said about it, but she saw in his eyes the satisfaction of someone who had handled a thing properly. And it was, in its way, entirely magnificent. The years that followed built themselves into the shape of a life that was full and varied and theirs entirely. The homestead grew steadily. Joseph added cattle, added a proper barn, improved the fencing, hired Sam Whitfield on permanent staff, and added a second hand named Will Cooper, a young man of 20 who reminded Belle slightly of Joseph at that age in his composure and his willingness to work. Tom grew from a running, talking, observing toddler into a boy of 6 and 7, who could already help his father with small tasks at the cattle, and who had inherited Belle's love of books in addition to his own particular interest in horses. Sarah Ann, true to her early character, grew into a child of considered opinions and great steadiness, who was already reading at 4 and who had, it turned out, a remarkable musical ear that expressed itself in a great desire to understand the fiddle, which led to an arrangement with Amos, the semi-retired fiddle player who had played at their wedding, to provide lessons during the winters. In 1879, a third child arrived, another boy whom they named Abel, for the man in Texas who had given Joseph his first real chance. Abel James Ramsey was red-haired, which surprised everyone and delighted Clara Finch, who had become a kind of honorary aunt to all the Ramsey children. He was a cheerful, energetic child with a loud laugh and a talent for finding the exact center of any situation and establishing himself there, which was either a quality or an occupational hazard, depending on the day. Clara had married Pete Stallo in 1876, and they had a farm 3 miles north of town, and Clara had 2 children of her own who played with Tom and Sarah, and Abel in the easy, rambling way of children who have known each other since before they could remember. The families were woven together by years of Saturdays and church socials and mutual crisis and shared celebration, and Belle counted this among the genuine wealths of her life. Caldwell changed through these years, as all of the Kansas cantons changed. The cattle drives that had defined the town began to thin as the railroad pushed further south and the trail routes shifted. New settlers came to the area, farming families who broke ground and planted and changed the character of the land and the economy. The town itself changed, becoming less of a rough-edged cattle stop and more of a proper settled community, with new buildings on Main Street and a proper school board and eventually a second church. Belle watched these changes with interest and without the particular nostalgia that some of the older settlers expressed. She had arrived in this place as a newcomer herself, and she understood that places changed because people arrived in them and changed them, and that this was not loss but transformation. The open range that the cattlemen mourned was already something transformed, and what came after it would be transformed in turn. The land itself remained, vast and patient, enduring the passage of what human beings made of it with the indifference of something very old. Joseph's feelings about the changes were more complicated. He had come to this land when it was still raw, and he had spent years learning its character in the way of someone who paid very close attention to where they were and what they were doing. The encroachment of fencing across what had been open range, the homestead claims that altered the patterns of cattle movement, the gradual transformation of the town from a canton to a farming community. These were things he accepted with the equanimity he brought to everything he could not change, but he sat with them quietly in a way that Belle understood as real. It was always going to change, she told him one evening on the porch with the summer dark around them and the children in bed and the cicadas making their tremendous noise in the grass. I know, he said. Does knowing make it easier? He thought about it. Knowing makes it make sense, he said. Easier is something different, she leaned against him. The land is still the land, she said. The creek is still the creek. The sky is still entirely unreasonable in the best possible way. He looked up at the sky, which was, in fact, doing something remarkable with stars. Yes, he said, that is true. She put her hand over his. And we are still here. He turned his hand over and held hers. Yes, he said, that is the most true thing. By the year 1881, the Ramsey homestead was one of the established properties of the Caldwell area, solid and well-regarded, known for the quality of its cattle and the character of the family that ran it. Joseph had the reputation he had built for himself over years, the man you could count on, the neighbor you wanted, the rancher who was fair and careful and did not waste words or effort on things that did not matter. Belle had built her own reputation as the woman with the library and the schoolroom correspondence and the remarkable good sense who had organized, with Clara Stallo and Margaret Dole, a small lending program for the area's farming families who could not easily get into town. Tom was 12 now, old enough to take real responsibility at the ranch, which he did with a seriousness and capability that made Joseph quiet with pride in the way that Joseph was quiet about everything that moved him deeply. Sarah Ann was 10 and could play the fiddle better than Amos himself, who said so without apparent regret, with the generosity of a teacher who understood that being surpassed was the point. Abel was 7 and loud and everywhere, already more comfortable on a horse than most adults, with a rapport with animals that seemed to exist outside of any teaching. One evening in October, 1881, after dinner, when the children were all in bed, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of a quiet that has been earned by a full and busy day, Belle and Joseph sat together on the porch with the autumn evening around them, not talking, just present in the way they had always been best at together. She was thinking about a letter she had received that morning from a woman named Helen Faraday in Wichita, who ran a school and had written to ask Belle's opinion on a curriculum question that had been troubling her for some time. She was thinking about Tom and the book he had asked for, a natural history she would write to Wichita to order. She was thinking about the quilt she was making for Abel's birthday. She was thinking about nothing in particular, which was also a form of thinking she valued, the mind moving freely over the landscape of a life, noting what was there. She became aware that Joseph was looking at her. She turned to look at him. The lantern from the kitchen window was behind her, and the October evening was clear, and she could see his face plainly, the lines that the years and the Kansas weather had added to it, the gray that had begun to appear at his temples, and beneath all of it the same quality she had seen that evening on the street in Caldwell 8 years ago when he had told her the truth about his silence. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. Then after a moment, "I was thinking about the morning I first saw you walk into Hector's store." She was quiet for a moment, warm with the memory of it. "You did not say a word to me." "No," he said. "I thought you disliked me." "I know," he said. "I was not particularly subtle." "You were spectacularly unsubtle," she said, "in the most confusing possible direction." He smiled. The full smile, the one that had arrived for the first time on a street in Caldwell in the summer of 1873 and which still every time made something in her chest go warm and certain. "I liked you too much," he said. "That was always the whole of it." "I know," she said. "You told me so." "I have never told you enough," he said. Belle looked at him, this man who was her husband and the father of her children and the person she had talked to and argued with and been held by and worked alongside for 8 years. And she thought about the evening on the porch of their first home when he had held his son for the first time, and the night of the blizzard when he had read to her by firelight, and the hundreds of ordinary mornings and evenings that were ordinary only in the way that all the really important things are ordinary. Present and continuous and entirely real. "You have told me," she said, "every day in the way you do." He looked at her steadily. "Is that enough?" "More than enough," she said. "Always." He reached over and took her hand, the way he had reached across the counter at the mercantile and across the breakfast table and across every distance that had been between them, and he held it in the same steady, warm way. The cottonwoods along the creek had gone to gold, and the Kansas sky above them was so full of stars that it seemed to lean toward the earth with the weight of them. And the night was cool and clean with the smell of autumn grass and the distant sound of the cattle settling for the evening. And from somewhere in the house behind them came the small, sleeping sounds of their children, Tom and Sarah and Abel, young and particular and entirely themselves. Belle looked out at the darkness of the land they had made theirs, and she felt the fullness of her life in the way she had learned to feel it, not as a grand and singular thing, but as 100 small, accumulated, everyday things that together made something that was entirely worth the living. Joseph squeezed her hand once gently, and she felt it all the way through. The October wind moved through the cottonwoods and made their gold leaves shiver, and the stars continued their ancient, indifferent work, and Belle Lockhart Ramsey sat on the porch of her house on the Kansas plain and thought that she had been given very much more than she had known to ask for, and that the best of it had started with a silence she had misread completely. It had started with a quiet man on a mercantile porch who had been looking at the distant horizon because the alternative was looking at her, and who had not known how to say what he was carrying until a direct woman in the blue of a summer evening had asked him straight, and he had told her straight. And everything that had come after had been the consequence of that honesty. This house and this land and these children, and this life, and this man who held her hand in the October dark, as though it were the most natural and necessary thing in the world, which it was, which it had always been. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he did not say anything, because he did not need to, and she did not need him to, because after 8 years she understood the language of his quiet the way she understood her own heartbeat, constant and present and entirely hers. The wind came through the cottonwoods again, and the stars wheeled slowly in their great, patient circle, and the land lay dark and vast and beautiful around them, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. In the years that followed, the Ramsey homestead and the family within it grew and changed and deepened in the way of all things that are rooted and cared for. Tom grew into a young man of remarkable capability, who eventually took on the greater part of the ranch management, working alongside his father with the ease of someone who had been trained not in the formal sense, but in the better sense, by years of honest example. Sarah Ann's music became known throughout the county, and she taught it freely to any child who wanted to learn, setting up in the schoolroom on winter evenings the same way her father had once borrowed books from a shelf, without anyone formally arranging it. Abel, true to his early character, went his own particular way, developing a talent for horses that eventually made him known among the ranching families of southern Kansas as someone worth consulting, a distinction he wore with the same comfortable loudness he brought to everything. Joseph and Belle grew older together in the way they had done everything together, with attention and honesty and the willingness to see each other clearly. The lines on his face deepened and the gray spread through his dark hair, and he was more patient with fewer words than ever, which she had not thought possible. She herself kept her books and her correspondence and her opinions, and she was known in the community as someone whose thinking was worth the seeking out, a reputation she had built quietly and over many years and which she wore, like most things, without making a performance of it. They argued occasionally, as they always had, with the fair, clear intensity of two people who respected each other too much to be dishonest. They reconciled the same way, directly and completely, without storing grudges to be used later. They laughed, often, in the particular way of people who have been paying close attention to each other for a long time, and know exactly what the other finds funny and occasionally exploit this deliberately. They sat on the south-facing porch in the evenings, as they had always done, through the summers and the autumns, and even the winters when the cold was manageable. And they watched the Kansas sky do its extraordinary work. And they talked or were quiet as the evening required. And there was never a moment in all those years when Belle Lockhart Ramsey doubted for a single instant that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, beside exactly the right person. On a September evening in 1885, when the air was warm and the cottonwoods were just beginning their first hint of gold, and Tom had taken the cattle into town for the fall sale and Sarah was at the Stallow farm with Clara and Abel was somewhere on the property doing something with a horse, Joseph brought 2 cups of coffee to the porch and sat beside Belle and handed her one. And she took it and drank and made the same small, satisfied sound she always made when the coffee was exactly right. Which it always was, because after 12 years he made it exactly as she liked it without being asked. He was quiet for a long time, looking at the horizon. "I have been thinking," he said. "About." She said, "About that morning I first saw you," he said, "and how long I stood on that porch looking at the horizon because I could not think of a single thing worth saying." Belle smiled into her coffee. "You have thought about that morning before." "I think about it regularly," he said. "I think about how it might have gone differently if you had not asked me directly, if I had gone on being silent until it became permanent." "You would not have," she said. "You are too honest for that." "I am glad you thought so," he said. "I was not certain of it at the time." She looked at him, this man at 52 who was still in every way that mattered, the same man who had stood on Hector Finch's porch and looked at the horizon rather than at her, composed and quiet and carrying more than he showed. "I was so certain you did not like me," she said. "I was absolutely convinced of it." "I know," he said. "I have never quite forgiven myself for that." "There is nothing to forgive," she said. "Without that certainty, I would never have asked you. And without asking you, we would never have had the answer." He looked at her. "You were always braver than I was," he said. "No," she said. "I was louder than you. That is not the same thing." His mouth moved. "It is close enough." She set down her coffee and leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the September evening while the cottonwoods whispered, and the Kansas sky did what the Kansas sky always did, which was to be enormous and extraordinary and entirely indifferent to the small, precious, irreplaceable particulars of the human life happening beneath it. And Belle Lockhart Ramsey, who had come to Caldwell, Kansas from Missouri in the spring of 1873, with her father and a list for curtain fabric and no expectation of anything beyond the next ordinary day, thought about all the distances she had traveled since then. Not in miles, but in the deeper sense. The distance between a girl and a woman, between loneliness and belonging, between the life you expect and the life that turns out to be yours. And she thought about the moment that had made all the difference, which was not a dramatic moment and not a grand gesture, but a simple, honest exchange on a Caldwell street in the blue of a summer evening, when she had asked a quiet man a direct question, and he had given her a true answer. He had been quiet because he liked her too much. And she, who had spent 2 months being certain it meant something else entirely, had learned something she carried with her from that evening forward, that the meaning of silence depended entirely on what was being held inside it, and that it was always, always worth asking. She held his hand. He held hers. The stars came out over Kansas, one by one, the way they always did, patient and enormous and beautiful beyond measure, and the evening settled around them like something completed, like the last line of a book you have been reading for a long time and whose ending, when it comes, is exactly right.